In August of 1955, Connecticut was hit by one of the worst natural disasters in the state's modern history. Over the course of 1 week, two hurricanes, Hurricane Connie and Hurricane Diane, collectively dropped more than 2 feet of water and raised the Farmington River by over 18 inches. These two storms and the subsequent flood of 1955 that resulted ended up causing over $680 million worth of damage across the Eastern Seaboard, with $350 million of that being dealt to Connecticut alone. In response to these damages, Governor Ribicoff declared a state of emergency, requested federal assistance from President Eisenhower, and activated the state's National Guard. By the end of the flood of 1955, 87 Connecticut residents had perished, 668 dwellings were destroyed, and over 200 dams suffered partial or total failure. Avon, located adjacent to the Farmington River, was not able to escape the impact of the hurricane, suffering extreme damages to its public infrastructure, farms, and houses. For this episode, we are joined by Janet Carville of the Pick and Patch Farm, who, being a lifelong resident of Avon, was able to experience the flood of 1955 firsthand. Thank you so much for being here with us. Special thanks to Deb Searson for her assistance in this episode's research. I think just getting started, can you give us a little bit of an introduction into your own personal background, who you are, what you did, especially before the flood?
My name is Janet Carville. I'm part of the Woodford family that helped settle Avon. Before it was a town in 1830, we came up from Farmington because we were one of the original settlers of Farmington. I worked on the farm as a kid, and back then, your own children could work on the farm, and they didn't have to be 14. Anybody else had to be 14 to work on a farm. So I put in a number of years before I was old enough to really get off the farm and get a real job. And the summer of 55, I had a real job at a bank in Simsbury, which was way different than working on the farm. And I can remember calling in and crying to my boss, please don't fire me. I want to work, but I can't get to work because the water's over the road. She said, don't worry about it. There'll probably be a lot of people that won't get to work either. But our farm has been on Nod Road since 1666, and way back in the beginning, all the other Avon original settlers were mostly farmers. If you had a cow and a chicken and a pig, or you made enough to feed your own family. And as we were able to produce a little bit more and sell it, we could afford to buy more land farther and farther down Nod Road. And finally, maybe 150-ish years ago, we sold the part that's now the golf course to the Alsop family, who also had a farm. And we had a registered Holstein herd of about 100 cattle, and we had shade tobacco, neither of which we're doing right now. But that kept us busy to keep the cows going, and they wanted to get milk twice a day. And the tobacco had to be in the ground by May 31st, or it wouldn't have a long enough growing season to be harvested before the kids went back to school. So the middle of August, when the flood hit, we had maybe a third to a half of our crop harvested, and some of it was hung up in the tops of the sheds to cure, and that part was not affected by the flood, but whatever else was on the farm was an awful mess.
From my understanding, you worked on the farm since very little. Since it's a family business, you were part of the family. It was kind of an all-hands-on-deck affair. What was farm life like for you personally, though? What did you do? Did you do everything, a little bit of everything, or did you
We did what we could do. There were some processes for the tobacco business that a 3-year-old could do, was pulling the strings off the lath, and many times I probably wasn't the best behaved child, and my mother would send me over to one of the tobacco sheds to take the strings off some of the bundles for punishment, and she could watch me from the kitchen window to make sure that I was doing what I was supposed to do. But it was a great way to grow up. We didn't have a movie theater, we didn't have a bowling alley, we didn't have a mall, we didn't have telephones, didn't even have television until I was in 7th grade. So we made our own entertainment. We had the woods and the mountain and bicycle rides all over the farm. We would roller skate in the street because there was never any traffic. It was a great way to grow up.
Did you have a lot of siblings when you were growing up?
I have a sister older and a sister younger, but there were 8 of us Woodford cousins that all lived within a quarter of a mile on Nod Road. So we always had somebody to play with.
And they all worked on the farm as well?
Unless they had other things to do. And once they got old enough to work off the farm, they couldn't wait to get off the farm.
Going back, you just got your first summer job off the farm, working at a bank right when the flood happened. Was it typical for people at your age to eventually get off the farm, or because I remember we did an episode with Cal Miller of Miller Farms, and she talked about how a lot of her family, it's also a family-run business, but people would work on the farm when they're young, leave the farm for a bit, and then come back. Is that what happens at Woodford Farm as
That's
well?
what happened to me. Yes.
I see.
In fact, when my husband was in high school, he worked part-time for the Millers.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we knew about them.
So you're still part of the farm now then, obviously, or...
I'm chairman of the board, which I think makes me officially a company gopher. I'm not active in it, but I did all the bookkeeping and payroll for 30 years or more.
I see. You talked about how you had to get the tobacco into the soil May 31st, or otherwise it wouldn't have a long enough growing season in order to be harvested later. The flood of 1955 happened, and as I remember in an earlier conversation, you talked about how this was in a similar time span to when the harvest season was happening.
The tobacco is not harvested all in one stage. You start with a few leaves at the bottom of the plant and work your way up as the plant grows. So you might go through each field 6, 7, 8 times, depending on how the crop grew. And we had picked and sown a lot of the tobacco and was hanging it in the sheds, the tops of the sheds. And by the time the flood hit, we were maybe 1/3 to a half through harvesting the crop. And a lot of the kids that work on the farm, you have to be 14 to work on a farm. And so all the kids in the valley had nothing to do between 14 and 16 when they were old enough to go out and do whatever they wanted to do for another job.
Right.
So we kept all the kids busy on the farm, and a lot of the parents liked that because some of the larger farms in Windsor had a farm in maybe Suffield or Westfield or who knows, Southwick, and everybody that worked on our farm stayed on Nod Road because we didn't have any other land elsewhere to grow the tobacco.
From June to the fall is hurricane season in Connecticut, am I right? How are farms typically impacted by hurricanes in the Farmington Valley? What's the normal procedure to reacting to this, or is there one?
Well, it depends on where the route of the storm is going. If we just on the fringes, we might have a lot of wind and some rain. If the eye of the storm is going right over us, we're going to have more damage. And it depends the path of the storm, what happens to us.
But have you personally had an experience prior to the flood of 1955 where there was a really bad storm, or has your family had that kind of experience?
Yes, I was too little to remember, but they had a hurricane in 36 and another one in 38 that impacted the farm. And I've heard stories about that, but we didn't have the mess that we had in 55. 55 really did a job on our farm.
Did the fact that this was, that the flood of 1955 happened in the middle of harvesting impact how the flood impacted the farm, or do you think it would have been equally disastrous regardless of the time that it came to the farm?
Well, if it came, the hurricane season in our area, they talk is from anywhere from June to the end of November, you can have a hurricane. And if it happened in the end of November, our crops would have been done for the season. We probably would have baled all the hay that we were going to bale for the cows, and it might not have been so bad. It could have blown down a building. It could have blown the dairy barn away, and who knows? We had a problem with the cows getting them all out.
So would you say that the fact that, for like, not just for your farm, but farms around Avon, since it was still a fairly rural community where a lot of people were farmers, that the storm happening when it did impacted the community a little bit more, or am I putting words in your mouth right now?
No, I would think it would have impacted the community more because for all the farmers that were in Avon at that time, August sounds like a pretty good ripe time to have most of your crop ready to harvest.
Right.
So it would have affected everybody. Depends on what you were growing.
Part of this, why I'm asking about the hurricane season, is because I was wondering, when the storm started to happen, did you guys have any expectation or idea that it would have been as bad as it was, or was it sort of like, oh, this is just another hurricane in hurricane season and we just got to get through this? Like, what was the initial reaction when the storm began?
I think we were probably a little better prepared back when the 36 and 38 hurricanes happened. The weather people were not able to predict with such accuracy as they can now. They didn't have all the equipment. And I guess the 38 hurricane did a real job, particularly down the southern part of the state. Yes, we were impacted, but it didn't do to us what the 55 flood did.
So you guys expected a really bad storm.
Well, we tied down what we could. We put under shelter anything that we could, all the tractors and trucks and other equipment, so it wouldn't blow away or wash away. But if a barn is going to blow down, we can't control that. And the cows wanted to get milk twice a day. They didn't care what the weather was doing. There's always that problem.
Right. So, okay. So a little bit of it, I'm thinking, is regardless of what it was going to be like, there was only so much you guys could do.
That's right.
And even if the forecast was like, oh, prepare for the worst storm ever, you guys could only really tie everything down, do what you could do, and hope to bunker it out, sort of. Is that what I'm getting?
Well, the fact that we had Hurricane Connie first, and then we ended up with 5 days of rain, the ground was thoroughly saturated.
Right.
And then when Hurricane Diane came along, the water had no place to go but up.
Right.
And the cows had to get out of the dairy barn. That was flooding, and that was quite a dramatic scene that day while we tried to rescue the 100 head of cattle that we had. They're not the smartest animals. You can't tell them to go over the other side of the road and sit there.
I mean, what was that process like, trying to rescue the cows? Was it frustrating?
We had that year. We had just bought a new tractor that had the exhaust pipe that went straight up in the air. The old tractors had their exhaust pipe lower, that if it had been underwater, you couldn't have run the tractor. Well, we had one fellow that we'd had to lasso one cow around the deck, drag her through the water to across the street where we lived, and there was the dirt road that went up to the field and back, and we kids had to shoo the cows back up in the pasture to get them out of the way, and the tractor would go back to the dairy barn, try to lasso another one. But the cows were afraid. They aren't the smartest animals, and they had always felt safe in the barnyard. So as they swam around the barn to get back into the barnyard, it was extra trouble to get them out of there, but that's where they all wanted to go. We were fortunate. We got all the animals out. There was one heifer that we lost that they found days later that was under some overturned back house in East Granby that had floated down the river. But by comparison, it was good. But that particular day, the cows wanted to get milk. You don't just say, hang on to it for a couple of days. But the farm down the road where the Alsop's farm was, they were up on a little bit higher ground, and we were able to get the animals down to their barn to milk them.
Well, I mean, you talked about this earlier, but there was Hurricane Connie, and then that was bad. That fully saturated the ground, and then there was 5 days of rain. And then there was Hurricane Diane, and that's what really caused the flood. But also part of this is, with the ground so fully saturated, Avon is right next to the Farmington River. And I mean, Avon's a little bit further from the Connecticut River as well, but like it's in the area, and those were what was really causing the flood, because those two obviously flooded. Sure. And what was that experience like for you guys? Did you guys know that the Farmington was going to flood? Were you guys trying to make any preparations for that, or what was that like?
Well, you can't stop the water from coming on the land. You can try to put away what you can and bring things to higher ground if you know what's coming. But the Farmington River, as it goes by our farm, actually is running north. That's why it got its name. It comes down from almost Canada and comes down to Farmington and turns around and heads north before it gets to Windsor Locks and dumps into the Connecticut River. So when it went through Winsted and made that horrible mess there and Unionville, it was all churned up, and there was all kinds of debris and garbage and gunk and mud and everything else. That by the time it got to our farm, we were inundated with things that took us many, many days to get a bulldozer to get the garbage off our land to get back to the topsoil.
Right. And you guys got it bad because you guys are very close to the Farmington River,
yes.
right? Yeah, you guys are right next to it.
Usually it's our friend, and for many years we've been able to use the water from the river to irrigate our crops when necessary.
But like, aside from even like just losing buildings, like obviously you guys still need to eat yourselves. Did you guys have food stored up? Were you guys sort of struggling in that department as well?
We didn't have the food like the Pick and Patch has today. We were shade tobacco and dairy cattle, and the Pick and Patch wasn't even a thought in anybody's mind at that point. But we all had freezers because most farmers always had a garden in their own home, and we grew what we could to can or preserve or freeze or pickle or do something to it to save it. And some of the homes that got flooded, of course, there was no electricity, and things that were in the freezer got ruined.
But in terms of like the eating part, you guys weren't like starving during the flood. You guys had enough.
Well, we didn't starve when the people. Our house was across the street from the main farm, and it's up a little bit, maybe 5 feet higher in elevation, which doesn't sound like much, but it was enough that all the people on the river side of the road came to our yard to get out of the high water. And someone came down in a rowboat and said that farther up the river, some big dam had broken. I didn't even know which one it was, but there was going to be an awful lot more water. And we figured, okay, we got to get out of here. Well, the Army came down Nod Road in a motorboat, but it could fit maybe 5 people in it. Well, we had 35 people in our yard that needed saving. So my mother and 2 sisters and I figured, well, we know the woods like the back of our hand. We started walking up the hill. We figured, who knows how long this water is going to be. We walked up the hill and headed south toward Route 44 and came out almost where the golf course is now.
Right.
And by then we could get back onto the road. And we went to the what's now the North House. I used to babysit for the folks that used to own it back then. And we knocked on the door, and it was still raining at that point. Said, can we come in out of the storm? She said, we don't have any rooms available. We don't want a room. Can we sleep on your floor? She said, I'm sorry, there's no room at the inn. Well, I didn't go back to that restaurant until after it changed hands again. We walked up halfway up the mountain and stayed in a house on the floor in somebody else's house that was way above the floodwaters.
You guys kind of escaped the flood because you guys, I mean, I wouldn't, like, your house, obviously your farm didn't escape the flood, but you guys, what I'm getting is it kind of happened incrementally. Like, some areas got it worse, so people were coming over, they landed at your farm, and they let you know that this is going to get really bad, and you guys got out of there way before the flood actually came and, like, took over your house. Or your farm. Is that getting...
Well, a lot of the family lived on Nod Road, and on those on the other side of the road have high water marks in their house. On the main floor, they might have had 5 or 6 feet of water, and everything got ruined, the furniture and the rugs and books or kitchen equipment or whatever you had.
But you guys were able to... You guys weren't, like, trapped in the water.
We weren't trapped in it.
You guys got out, went up and found housing elsewhere.
The water surrounded the house where I grew up, and it filled the basement with water. And I think if we'd had another inch of water, it would have come through to the first floor. But there was all that gunk hanging from the ceiling of the basement that was the bottom of the living room floor. But we couldn't stay there for a couple nights until the water went down. Then the town had to come in. The fire department came in and had to spray lime around to keep infection from going, and we got loaded into a pickup truck that took us to the top of Avon Mountain and down Deer Cliff Road to go to Farmington, where we had to get a tetanus shot because there was that problem to contend with. And finally we could get back and hoe out the mess in our house, plus the work on the farm.
What was obviously your house was, your farm got completely flooded. It was trashed. A lot of your cattle was, a lot of your crops were ruined, your harvest was ruined. But also it was a very dangerous experience for you, your family, and as you talked about earlier, your dad went into town, and you guys completely lost contact with him during the entire experience. I guess, what was your personal experience during the flood? What were you feeling during this period? Or
I was scared because if there had been another dam farther up the river that had given way, and whatever we had for a flood was going to be far worse, are we going to have any house to go back to? Where are we going to live?
Right.
Everything we own is there. We did have a lot of things stored in our basement, which of course got thrown out, and the water completely surrounded our house. The garage floor was all dirty, but we didn't have it on the main living floor of the house. We were awful close to it, though.
So that's something I didn't even think about. Like, obviously during the flood, like in the flood, you're like, okay, what's going to happen to me? Is this, am I in danger? But also after the matter, a lot of it's like, oh, what now, right?
Yeah.
Like, what is my farm still going to be there? Is my life that I had before, do we have to completely rebuild, or what's that process like?
It's scary.
So
I'm sure my ancestors worried about the same thing in the 300 years they were there before then.
Did you guys know if it was going to be over soon, or were you guys sort of like, we have no idea when this is going to end?
We didn't know. When they came down the road in the boat and said, get out, the water is going to be worse because the dam broke upstream, way upstream, there was no communication. There was no electricity. There was no texting on your phone. There was no phone service. There was no we just didn't know.
No radio. The state didn't
We didn't have we didn't have anything. We had the clothes on our back.
So you guys, it was a lot. Was your dad still with you at this point, or
there was 5 days we didn't know if he was dead or alive. He was stuck over in Unionville and couldn't get back to Avon.
I mean, my next question was sort of based off of like the town of Avon in the state of Connecticut and any aid they sent during the flood and the hurricane. But from what I'm getting, a lot of it was you guys just straight up didn't even know because you guys had no connection.
Had no communication with anybody.
But I guess after the matter, did they send aid, or what was that like?
Well, I heard stories that the church in the center, right across from O'Neill's here, had a gas stove in their kitchen at the time, and they made a barrel of soup, and they had people sleeping on the church pews, and we couldn't even get there. We couldn't
Wow.
get across the river because it was just an ocean. But because the river flows north, the farther north you went, the deeper the water was. So on Route 44, we could get down, to the Route 10 intersection, but not an awful lot farther. And of course, then the hill goes up into the center of Avon. So the center of Avon didn't have floodwaters. I'm sure they had a lot of rain, but everybody's got their own story where they were.
And how did the flood end? Like, what was that process like? Obviously, it was, how many days was it? It was 5 days, I believe.
Well, it was 5 days of rain, and then Hurricane Diane.
I see.
But the next day, that was August 19th that we had the flood. By the 20th of August, it was a beautiful sunlit day, low humidity. It was just a gorgeous day if you looked up. But anything, the trees and the telephone cables north of us just had debris and branches and garbage hanging from them, and everything else was brown. The water went down reasonably fast in a day or two, except for the fields that were still kind of muddy, but the road could open then, and we could go back to our houses and see what there was.
What was that feeling walking back home? Or I don't know how you got back home. I'm assuming walking. Or just getting back home and seeing the aftermath of the flood. What was that like, seeing your farm?
Well, at least relief. The house was still there. The farm was still there. We didn't know, I was probably not in the management of the farm at that time. And let the older folks worry about it. But I figured, jeepers, have I got any clothes to wear? But upstairs in our closets, the clothes were not. The first floor and the second floor were not inundated with water. But the back porch and the garage and the basement were a mess.
And you already sort of talked about this part, but it took a long time to clean out the flood. Obviously, like the trash, the debris that was brought up by the flooding rivers. What was that? I'm assuming that was also all hands on deck part. But earlier you mentioned how you had all these different farm hands from your cousins who worked or who lived around the area. Were they able to lend a hand for the farm, or were they also worrying about their own part?
Well, they were taking care of their own house.
Right.
As far as picking more tobacco and sewing it and hanging it in the sheds, that didn't happen because the fields were underwater. Whatever was left in the field got ruined. So all the employees that we had, we didn't need because there wasn't anything to do there. And you can't slave labor the 14-year-old kids to do the volume of work that we had to have done.
So it was all just your family. I'm assuming
pretty much
so.
so.
It was I'm assuming that was very intensive. That couldn't have been a
Yes.
pleasant process.
Now, I don't even think we had a bulldozer. We had to hire somebody with a bulldozer
Oh, wow.
to get down to get the land back to us. But it was a mess.
How much property did you lose to the flood? Like, obviously, it was the year's harvest, so there was that part. But
There might have been 100 acres or so on that side of the road. That certainly was a mess. And as far as the pasture land up and back, that wasn't flooded. But being summertime, the cows could sleep outside at night. That part, it was in the middle of winter.
Yeah.
You had to get warmer housing for the cows. We kept them. We were able to milk them down at the Alsop farm. I think that was a couple days before we could get back in. But anything that was electric, we didn't have any power. We had to run extension cords or get an electrician to put us back in business.
Oh, so during the entire process of cleaning up, no power. It was a complete power outage.
Until they tried to restore, the farms and the businesses. But everybody had their own set of problems.
So it was kind of everyone on their own for that period. It wasn't. There was no mass, like, the town wasn't able to come in and offer a huge amount of help because
Well, they were clearing the roads as they could, but
Right.
Nod Road wasn't the only road in Avon that was affected. They had all over. They were busy.
I guess I ask about the property loss because I'm assuming losing a year's harvest would be. I mean, it wasn't a full year's harvest. You guys had already begun the process, but losing a harvest like this would definitely have long-term impacts because that's where the money comes from. So I was wondering, and just collectively, the town of Avon was very rural, a lot of farmers. I was wondering, did you ever hear of stories, or are you aware of whether or not Avon as a whole kind of suffered long-term from that because of lost harvest or lost...
I don't have any facts to answer your question, but everybody had their own set of problems.
Right.
And you dipped into your pocketbook to pay the difference, or you just didn't grow as much the next year, or you did what you could.
Do you feel like the town was well equipped at all to handle a flood like this, or do you feel like it was pretty unprepared?
Oh, I don't want to slam the town because they've done very good things for us right along, and we've been friends for many, many years.
It was 70 years ago. I'm sure they're all gone now.
Well, you never know. I'm still around. But, things happen, and the town did what they could, and people helped neighbors. If you had some food and I didn't have any, you shared. I'll admit that during that time when we didn't have any, our well got ruined, so we didn't have any drinking water, and I've had more telephone calls at that time. You rejoiced because someone would call up and say, would you like to come over and take a bath? And it was the most welcome thing that we could hear. And maybe they'd give us a meal too.
I know during this process, the then governor of Connecticut, Governor
Ribicoff, was it?
Yeah, Governor Ribicoff had actually contacted President Eisenhower about the flood. Did you see any national response in the area, or is that more concentrated in areas that were hit worse?
I think that like Pomfret and Winsted and Waterbury, there were Unionville certainly were far more devastated than our little farm on Nod Road. I mean, we're small potatoes by comparison, but yes, the government did come in to help, and I don't know what arrangements other people made to.
But nothing in Avon.
Not that I knew of.
And how do you think the community in Avon was impacted overall? There were 87 Connecticut residents that passed away during the storm. Do you know if anyone in Avon suffered these kinds of losses? Was there a period of grieving afterwards?
Well, general grieving, because not so much, yes, the loss of life, but pets that got killed or property that really got ruined. There was a lot of, I think we were all in shock probably. Wondered, did this really happen, or going to wake up tomorrow and it's going to all be over? But that wasn't the case.
From what I've seen and heard about these types of like large-scale disasters is afterwards a big thing that happens a lot is a lot of unity and solidarity. And I feel like from what you've told me about farmer or neighbors sharing water, sharing food if they can, did you feel like Avon felt more together afterwards, or Connecticut maybe even as a whole felt more together, or
there's certainly a lot fewer people in town than there are now, and we knew most everybody in town, and everybody was willing to help where they could. I can remember down the road, about a half a mile from our house, there was a natural brook that came down and had a mini waterfall that maybe was 6 feet, or if it was that, and an area about the size of this room that had a rock bottom to it. And it had maybe 10 inches of water in it. That was our bathtub. We'd go hiking down the road with a bar of soap and a towel to take a bath in the woods. And by the time we got all cleaned up, and the mosquitoes would eat us alive, by the time we got home, we were all chewed up and sweaty again, but we had a bath.
And also the resiliency, I think. That's definitely something to think about. It's huge loss of property across the state. I'm sure a lot of people stepped up who had extra to give.
Oh, sure.
And were able to do that. But, it takes a good deal of resiliency just from yourself, seeing your house washed away or seeing all your property flooded and thinking, you know what, this is bad, but it's nothing we can't recover from. And I feel like that's...
New Englanders are very resilient, and back in 55 when there were more farms in town, and the farmers that settled the town, you had to weather through the storm. You couldn't just call up and have pizza delivered or something.
Right.
We had to make do or do without.
There was no like, this is too tough. I'm gonna take a night in and just sleep for a week. You had to get right back into it.
You had to do it, particularly with the cows that wanted to get milk twice a day. It wasn't their fault.
I like how a lot of this episode has focused mostly on how the cows have dictated your lifestyle. Like, okay, I want to take a day off, but the cows need to get milk still.
Well, you had to get somebody to milk the cows.
I mean, so we covered a lot of ground, I think, and we're nearing the end. As you talked about, Avon has changed a lot between 1955 and now. There were a couple thousand people back then. There are, I think, around 18,000 people here now.
18 to 20, somewhere there.
Yeah, and a lot of new faces. There's no way everyone here knows each other anymore because there's just too many people.
I'm the newcomer.
Part of that is also a lot of these stories, like the flood of 1955, which was a huge event, which completely transformed not just Avon, but the entire state of Connecticut in so many ways, with new dams being built, with the infrastructure being renovated. Like, this story has more or less faded from public memory. And I think as someone who lived through it, I was wondering, what do you believe, in your opinion, the legacy of the flood should be in the Avon mind or in Connecticut?
That there was an awful lot of damage. There was a lot of loss of life, but not necessarily all Avon people. Certainly from Pomfret to Winsted to, downriver, there were far more exciting, not exciting, but eye-opening stories to be told. And we did what we could.
This podcast is an Avon Historical Society production, edited by me, Ethan Guo. Special thanks to Priscilla Marshall for the graphics. If you'd like to support this podcast, please subscribe and leave a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever else podcasts are downloaded. Want to be featured on a future episode or stay up to date with the podcast newsletter? Feel free to reach out to us at avontalksahs@gmail.com. For more on the Avon Historical Society, visit www.avonhistoricalsociety.org.